Well, in case anyone thought the Trump administration wasn't serious about bringing back the Monroe Doctrine, the snatch job on Maduro should disabuse anyone of that notion. The message could not be clearer. Opposition will not be tolerated. We are cleaning up the backyard. Hostile states, especially those explicitly allied with the Axis, will not be tolerated. Bogota and especially Havana have been put on notice. Mexico is technically too, although the dynamic there is different due to the central government not actually controlling much of the country. I'd say R/Canada should watch their backs now, but they're the opposite of politically relevant, so they're probably safe, ironically. America's favorite pastime of fucking around in the Western Hemisphere is back for another season, when everyone had hoped it had been cancelled after the Soviets buckled. To be sure, purely from a strategic perspective, this is a great idea, especially as executed. The Americans lost nothing, the operation was done in a couple of hours, and flipping Venezuela gives them another card in their favor against their opponents. If they get Venezuela's petroleum industry back on its feet, they can tank oil prices and cripple the Russian economy, which would be doubly painful given the production problems they're facing under the CIA-backed Ukrainian drone strikes on their energy infrastructure. It also gives them an alternative lever on oil prices besides Saudi Arabia, which they do not actually control, only cooperate with, making that lever less secure, especially since the Saudis continue to play both sides by courting the Chinese as well. China won't really be affected oil-wise since they can just get their rock-bottom oil from the Russians now instead, but it doesn't eliminate what you might call their forward outpost in America's backyard. There won't be a Cuba-style enemy fortress right in Uncle Sam's neighborhood this time around, assuming they similarly quash anyone else who cozies up to China this side of the Pacific, which it's pretty obvious now that they will. Of course, pursuing national security policy through flagrant military force is quite amoral, but as I admitted last year, this is the world we're in now. Only the Americans ever actually cared whatsoever about any kind of morality in exercising their foreign policy. The Europeans don't count, as all they do is talk. They have no power projections, so their stances don't really mean anything. If they abandon it, and they have, there is no one to pick up the torch. Yes, in theory, Europe could, and they certainly talk like they could, but the reality is the EU will not become a unified country willingly, and thus Europe will never have a unified foreign policy or be a unified major power unless one of the two nuclear powers on that continent takes it upon themselves to effect such by force, which, given their current attitudes, I don't see ever happening. The world is now merely a chessboard on which the imperial nuclear powers contest each other without direct combat. No one is operating within any kind of principled moral guidelines no matter what they say, unless you count national self-interest as an automatical moral good, which I suppose some would. I prefer universal principles myself, but I can plainly see that those aren't so popular at the moment. Given that, I've decided to take my copium prescription and tell myself it could be worse, which many anti-Trumpers will say is nonsense, but truly, think about it. I have deep ideological disagreements with MAGA, and I am also suspicious of Trump's capacity to do his job reliably, simply on a basic psychological level, owing to his advanced age and obvious narcissistic personality disorder that causes him to habitually agree to do the bidding of whoever he talked to last. But if I am to be under the thumb of an imperial power, and make no mistake, no matter what the elbows up crowd insists Canada is, only the most reactionary anti-Americans can seriously argue we'd be better off in China or Russia's sphere of influence than America's. America's satellites may not be treated fairly, what imperial possession can be by their very nature, but at least they are less likely to be impoverished totalitarian shitholes like those that fall under Chinese or Russian domination. I do not like Donald Trump, but in the field of realistic candidates for regional or global hegemon, he is arguably the least objectionable. He is objectionable by prior standards of American politics and by establishment European standards, but sadly his competition are even worse, so what choice do we really have? Granted, not that he'd give us one anyway. No American president would let Canada slip out of their orbit. And you can rightly say, since I just admitted it, I'm coping. I'm trying to make myself feel better about a situation I should be outraged about. And you'd be right. The trouble is, I'm not in any position to do a goddamn thing about it, nor is my country. So sure, I could remain perturbed indefinitely about it, but that would, frankly, feel like shit. It's not that I don't wish things were better, but doing so earnestly, having the expectation that it will happen, is merely setting yourself up for perpetual disappointment. So I instead try to adopt the position of the largely detached, if passively permissive observer, watching how the chess game plays out, speculating on the moves the players will make. It's much more interesting and more tolerable to treat the situation that way instead of being indefinitely outraged, which only makes it feel impossible to ever be contented. On that note, I have to give Colby and company, likely including Rubio and Vance at this point, credit. The U.S. is currently exercising a more coherent foreign policy than under either Bush or Obama. There was a clear geostrategic logic behind reasserting the Monroe Doctrine and changing tack to confront the Chinese head-on. The trouble, ironically, is the instrument they're using to implement it. Donald Trump cannot get out of his own way. His personal hang-ups on issues like getting a Ukraine peace deal and trying to have a dominating trade relationship with any country, even if it's one he should be wooing instead, counteract his own supposed national security strategy. Case in point, pissing off Europe and India by trying to extract trade concessions rather than trying to pull them away from the Chinese. His suggestibility doesn't help either. Try as they might to get the US untangled from the Middle East, his advisors can do nothing to stop MBS and Bibi from buttering him up to keep the gravy train flowing. A massive Achilles heel given that bogging the Americans down in a quagmire against Iran is the most surefire way for the Chinese to emerge victorious. So to be sure, the actual execution of the strategy is far from perfect due to Trump's personal hamstrings, but they've certainly done a better job getting him to execute at least part of their strategy compared to Obama, who famously had an anti-China policy on paper and then totally ignored it in favor of getting even more bogged down in the Middle East. The real test is going to be whose delusions are more debilitating, China's or America's. The Americans still don't seem to have truly internalized the need for rapid and large-scale industrial policy to rebuild their manufacturing base, specifically to support war production, and successful stunt like this Venezuela op will not help with that. No matter how competent their military is, you cannot fight without ammo and spare parts, and China is now the manufacturing center of the entire planet. The way the US carries on maintaining 11 aircraft carriers and trying to maintain sufficient escorts for them as if they still have the world's largest shipbuilding industry is ridiculous. Yet they both refuse to change strategy or make the investment necessary to correct the situation, since the Republican Party doesn't believe in the government doing things that a private entity could do instead. They keep relying on incentivizing private action rather than just using state power to get the job done, the result being that they don't get anywhere on the matter. The supply bottlenecks they're running into trying to supply even meager amounts of munitions to Ukraine in what is effectively an economic proxy war with the Chinese should be a wake-up call, but I see scant evidence they're planning to do anything about it beyond try to end the war so they can stop sending Ukraine ammo and begin stockpiling it for themselves. They're setting themselves up for a winter war writ large, where they dominate their larger opponent until they run out of ammo and are then forced to concede the fight. Of course, the Chinese really need to be looking in the mirror after the setbacks that had befallen the other Axis members. Putin's coup de main in Ukraine fell apart immediately due to his entire military apparatus being built on an endless parade of lies and deception that prevent problems from ever being solved due to, ultimately, his own ego and pride. He is now bogged down in a meat grinder that has dragged on for him as long as World War II did for Stalin, yet he is barely any closer to victory despite backing from all his pals. Iran has had their power projection crippled in the near term by Israel, though not ended thanks to Bibi intentionally leaving Hamas and Hezbollah extant, despite all the precautions apparently taken to immunize themselves from counterattack. And two junior Axis members, Syria and Venezuela, have fallen in the same time frame, despite being armed and supported by Russia and China. the Axis spews a lot of propaganda about how militarily mighty they are, yet they can never execute military campaigns with the competency of American or American-backed forces. And if they don't stop lying to themselves and learn how to fight properly, how to set and achieve realistic military objectives, and how to use their material superiority properly, it won't matter how many missiles and ships and troops China has, because the whole PLA may, like the armed forces of their allies, be a rotten scaffold that's merely been repainted innumerable times to try to hide it. Nevertheless, they still have an advantage materially, which is extremely important, because it means that they are, or become, a competent military power. The Americans run out of credible deterrence besides their nuclear stockpile, which makes every confrontation between the two not only of much higher stakes, but more likely to be conceded in China's favor willingly to avoid a nuclear holocaust, so long as China's demands aren't existentially threatening to them, obviously, depending on who plays the game of brinksmanship better, of course. And I don't feel prepared to speculate on who would at this point. Ultimately, the Americans are at least playing the game now, though they are still arguably not playing it properly, and they risk catastrophe if they gamble wrong on their use of force without fixing their industrial shortcomings. It's a step in the right direction, but victory, to a large extent, still relies on their enemy being moronic, which is not an unrealistic assumption, but is frighteningly risky when you consider the consequences if that assumption turns out to be wrong. Without taking concrete steps to re-industrialize their country, they are playing a dangerous game, and despite my misgivings with their current government, I dread a world where they outright lose. But as I said before, my country and I are not in a position to do anything about it. Neither to resist them, nor to majorly sway their competition with China. Really, we can only sit back and watch the show unfold. Popcorn is from the Americas, as it happens.